In this short video, I would like to discuss Anselm's ontological argument for God's existence. This is an argument that has perplexed philosophers for a very long time, ever since it was first written, which was about 950 years ago. This is a very perplexing argument, but whether or not you agree with its conclusion, this argument should be fascinating because it forces us to think about what existence is, how our concepts work, and how much we can conclude about reality just by using our reasoning alone, in the absence of the evidence of our five senses. Okay, so Anselm wants to prove that God exists. He wants to prove that theism is true. Moreover, he thinks that we can prove God's existence a priori. That is, he thinks that we can give a proof just by using our reason. We do not need to rely for this argument on observation, and we do not need to do any experiments or gather any evidence using our five senses. Rather, he thinks that we can prove that God exists just by reasoning with our concept of God. It's as if he thinks that we can give a mathematical proof of theism just by appealing to definitions and logic. This aspect of Anselm's argument should strike you as baffling. Just ask yourself, do you think that you can prove the existence of some being that's out there without ever using observation, just by thinking about your concepts? Anyway, that's what Anselm thinks he can do. Let's see how he attempts to do this. Rather than going through the argument exactly as Anselm presented it, let me just give my own reconstruction of the argument. Hopefully this will be a little bit more manageable. All right, here's the argument. Premise 1. I have a concept of a being that is the greatest conceivable being, the GCB, namely God. Premise 2. If the greatest conceivable being did not exist, then I can conceive of a being that is even greater, namely the GCB that also exists. Premise 3. So if the greatest conceivable being did not exist, then it would not be the greatest conceivable being. That's a contradiction. Conclusion. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being must exist. In other words, God must exist. Let me say a little bit about this argument strategy. Basically, what Anselm is trying to do is that he's trying to show that the atheist's view contains a contradiction in it. He's basically saying to the atheist, look, atheist, we can all agree on the definition of God. You agree that God is defined as the greatest conceivable being. But on your view, God also doesn't exist. And so on your view, God isn't the greatest conceivable being. So you must think that God both is and isn't the greatest conceivable being. That shows that your view is self-contradictory. And so your atheistic view must be false. In other words, God must exist. Here's an alternative way to think about the argument. Perhaps this is a bit simpler. Let's lay it out like this. Premise 1. If God did not exist, then God would not be the greatest conceivable being. Premise 2. But God is the greatest conceivable being, by definition. Conclusion. Therefore, God must exist. Okay, so that's the argument. It's kind of mind-boggling, isn't it? If you find this argument confusing, then that's totally fine. You're definitely not alone. I think it's fair to say that almost everybody who first encounters this argument finds it confusing at first. Many of you will probably feel like it's some sort of trick. But in philosophy, we can't just dismiss an argument because it feels to us like it's a trick. We have to actually analyze the argument and look under the cover and see how it works. So how do we analyze an argument? Well, for a deductive argument like this one, there are two things that we need to check. First, is the argument valid? And secondly, is the argument sound? I'm going to leave it to you to think about these things for yourself. Maybe it would be valuable for you to investigate on your own and make up your own minds. Philosophy can help you by giving you the tools for how to think about these problems. For example, we now know how to analyze arguments using the concepts of validity and soundness. For this video, I'm just going to give you two more things to think about. Both of these are going to be fairly influential objections that philosophers have raised to Anselm throughout the years. The first objection comes from a contemporary of Anselm named Gunilla. Gunilla read Anselm's work and he thought to himself, there must be something wrong with this argument. You can't just prove the existence of a being by thinking with your concepts. But Gunilla did not know how to identify where exactly he thought that Anselm's argument went wrong. So what Gunilla did instead is he offered a parody of Anselm's reasoning. Here's how it goes. Gunilla invites us to imagine a perfect lost island out there in the ocean that we have not yet discovered. He defines this island as the greatest conceivable island. Now suppose that this island didn't exist. Gunilla then asks, to echo Anselm, wouldn't this island be even greater if it did exist? And if so, then if this island doesn't exist, then haven't we ended up in a contradiction? Namely, we have conceived of an island that both is and is not the greatest conceivable island. That's a contradiction. Therefore, according to Anselm's reasoning, this island must exist. So, Gunilla's main point is not that he endorses the conclusion of this argument. Rather, his main point is that this argument should not work. We cannot prove the existence of a real island out there in the ocean just by reasoning with our concepts. He thinks that something has to have gone wrong in our reasoning. But then, Gunilla says, if there is a mistake somewhere in my argument for the perfect island, then there must also be a mistake in Anselm's reasoning. That is because the two arguments follow very similar steps. So even if I cannot identify where exactly Anselm's argument goes wrong, I can be confident that Anselm must have gone wrong somewhere. Anyway, that is what Gunilla says in response. I'm going to now leave it to you as to what to think about all of this. Here's some questions to think about. Is the island argument really analogous to Anselm's argument? How do you think that Anselm might respond to Gunilla? Is there a relevant difference between the greatest conceivable being and the greatest conceivable island? And lastly, is it right for Gunilla to reject Anselm's argument if he can't show where the argument goes wrong? Is offering a parody of Anselm's argument really enough to refute him? I have one more response to mention. This objection is a little bit more recent. It was discussed by some philosophers from the Renaissance and more recently by modern logicians. I admit that this objection is a little bit harder to digest without using the tools from logic, but we'll try to do our best without using any material from a course in logic. Okay, so premise one of the argument says that if God did not exist, then God would not be the greatest conceivable being. Why is this? Well, according to Anselm, it's because if God did not exist, then we can conceive of a being that's greater, namely a God that also has the property of existence. In other words, having the property of existence makes for a greater being. But is this true? Some philosophers have claimed that it isn't. According to them, existence is not like other properties. Logically speaking, it behaves very much unlike a property. To see what they mean by this, I want you to right now conceive of a unicorn. Picture a unicorn with your mind. What are you imagining? Presumably, You are conceiving of something that is a creature with 4 legs, a horse-like body, a mane, and a certain color, and of course, the horn on its head. Okay, now I want you to keep on imagining that unicorn, but now add to it the property of existence. Imagine that it exists. Now I ask, has your concept of the unicorn changed at all? Are you now conceiving of a unicorn that has a new property that the old one did not have? Some philosophers have argued no. They claim that the concept of an existing unicorn is no different than the concept of a unicorn. Existence doesn't add anything to your concept. According to these philosophers, to say that a unicorn exists is just to say there is something that has all the properties of a unicorn. It is to say that there is a horse-like creature with a horn on its head. But to say that unicorns exist is not to add existence to the list of attributes that unicorns have, according to our concept of them. Similarly, according to these philosophers, to say that God exists is just to say there is a being that has all of God's attributes. It is to say that there is a being that is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, etc., etc. But to say that God exists, according to these philosophers, does not add existence to the list of attributes of God, according to our concept of him. If these philosophers are right, then Anselm has made a mistake. Anselm asserts that if we conceive of God as existent, then we've conceived of something that is greater than anything that lacks the property of existence. But if these philosophers are right, then existence doesn't really work that way. Properly speaking, existence isn't a property that we can build into our concepts of things. Anyway, this is all a very subtle point that these philosophers are making about the logic of existence. If we wanted to be more precise about it, we would have to do some actual logic. And I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to leave this as a sample of how some philosophers have objected to Anselm's argument. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed having your mind blown by Anselm's argument.